Hello, I'm Kitsik from the University of Cologne, and in this talk I will make an ethical case for ethics-first social metaphysics. What does this mean? Let's begin with what I mean by social metaphysics. This term is normally used interchangeably with the term social ontology, and it is taken to mean metaphysics about the social. Metaphysics of social entities, kinds, properties, and so on. For example, Brian Epstein writes, social ontology is the study of the nature and properties of the social world. But in my sense, social metaphysics is not necessarily about something social, but it is rather metaphysics done for the society. Metaphysics that is supposed to have implications for social practices. Socially significant metaphysics. There is an overlap between social metaphysics in the usual sense and in my sense. For example, the topic of group agency. The main metaphysical question here is whether groups can be agents over and above their individual members, whether the group can have attitudes of its own that somehow result from the individual members deliberating or voting, for example. This is a metaphysical question about something social, the group, and it also seems to be a socially significant question. It seems to be significant for our practices of blaming and praising and punishing and rewarding groups. Another example of overlap between socially significant metaphysics and metaphysics about the social is metaphysics of gender. Take the question, what makes someone a woman? Is it the genitals or chromosomes or self-identification with the label woman or being labeled as a woman by others? This is a metaphysical question about something social, the social kind women, and it also has implications for social practices, like who should be allowed in women's spaces. But the overlap between socially significant metaphysics and metaphysics about the social is not complete. Consider the issue of artificial intelligence and the question of whether a certain sort of robot would be conscious. This is not a question about something social because a robot doesn't seem to be a particularly social sort of thing. But the question does have social significance. It has implications for how we should treat the robot, it seems, like whether we should welcome the robot into our society and take it to have the same sorts of rights and obligations that humans have. Another example of a non-overlap between socially significant metaphysics and metaphysics about the social is the topic of personal identity. Let's consider a fission scenario where somehow one person becomes two. And the metaphysical question then is which post-fission or post-splitting person is the same as the original. This is not a question about something social, it's about human individuals, but it does seem to have implications for social practices. For example, the question who should receive the correspondence addressed to the original person or who should pay their debts. Now, why do I focus on social metaphysics in this unusual sense of socially significant metaphysics? This is because I'm interested here in the methodology of social metaphysics. And it's unclear to me whether any distinct methodological issues arise with respect to the study of social entities or kinds, as opposed to other sorts of entities or kinds. But distinct methodological questions do seem to arise for social metaphysics in my sense, the sense of socially significant metaphysics. The methodological question that I have in mind here is whether we should address these socially significant metaphysical questions in an ethics-first or metaphysics-first manner. The ethics-first approach here means that the implications of the metaphysical verdict for social practices are somehow considered or taken into account in the course of coming to the metaphysical verdict. And the metaphysics-first approach is just a negation of that. It means that the implications of the metaphysical verdict for social practices are not considered in the process of doing metaphysics. For example, according to the metaphysics-first approach, we should resolve the metaphysical question of what makes someone a woman first, and then this result should inform our social practices. But on the ethics-first approach, our ethical reflection on who should be allowed in women's spaces, for example, should somehow inform our metaphysical verdict. Here is the plan for the rest of the talk. First, I will further clarify the ethics-first and metaphysics-first distinction. Then I will make the further second-order distinction between ethics-first and metaphysics-first approaches. These are distinct approaches to defending either of the first-order approaches. And finally, I will offer my own ethics-first case for the ethics-first approach to social metaphysics. So let's take a closer look at the metaphysics-first and ethics-first approaches. The metaphysics-first approach seems to be implicit in how the investigation of these socially significant metaphysical issues is often motivated. The idea seems to be that we need to figure out the metaphysical issue in order to figure out how to organize our social practices. For example, this is how Erik Olson motivates the topic of personal identity. He asks us to imagine that surgeons are going to put your brain into my head, and it's important to figure out how personal identity works here, according to him, because we want to figure out whether we should hold the resulting person responsible for your actions or for mine. And this is how Jennifer Lackey motivates the group agency issue. She writes, if National Semiconductor, for instance, is to be treated as an entity over and above its members in bearing responsibility for defrauding the government, then it is essential to determine whether the company believed or knew that the required tests were being committed, and so on. So the idea is that we need to figure out whether companies can really believe or know, because this should inform our decision on whether to treat the companies as bearing responsibility. But on the contrasting ethics-first approach, our ethical reflection on social practices informs the metaphysical verdict. Hilary Putnam, on his paper on artificial intelligence, seems to take an ethics-first approach to the issue of robot consciousness. He concludes that this question calls for a decision and not for a discovery. And in making that decision, it seems preferable to him to extend our concept of consciousness so that robots are conscious, because discrimination based on the softness or hardness of the body parts seems as silly as discriminatory treatment of humans on the basis of skin color. So here, our ethical reflection on how we should treat the robot informs our metaphysical verdict on whether to attribute consciousness to the robot. Amy Thomason a bit similarly discusses the criteria for personal identity. She acknowledges that these criteria make a big difference to our lives. And importantly, she suggests that we think of resolving these debates not as a matter of discovering the true criteria, but rather as deciding what criteria we ought to adopt. And if we think about the issue in this way, then it seems to make sense to decide these criteria of personal identity by reflecting on what sorts of social practices we should adopt. For example, our reflection on whether the post-fission, on which of the post-fission persons should receive the original person's correspondence, this reflection would then serve as input for our verdict on the metaphysical issue. So again, ethical reflection on social practices informs the metaphysical verdict. And likewise, we might suggest that Perhaps our ethical reflection on who should be allowed in women's spaces should inform our metaphysical verdict on what makes someone a woman. And our ethical reflection on punishing and praising groups should inform our metaphysical verdict on whether groups can be agents in their own right. So these were the ethics first and metaphysics first approaches to social metaphysics. But how do we decide or choose between these approaches? This is where the second order metaphysics first and ethics first approaches come in. According to the second order metaphysics first approach, we should adopt either of the first order approaches because this contributes to getting the metaphysics right or to doing metaphysics well. And according to the second order ethics first approach, we should adopt the first order metaphysics first or ethics first approach for ethical reasons. Let's look at examples. Here's a metaphysics first case for metaphysics first social metaphysics. The idea is that when we consider the implications of our metaphysical verdict for social practices, then this could compromise the objectivity of our metaphysical inquiry. For example, when we think about the issue of robot consciousness, then we should think about just that. And we should push out from our thoughts any consideration of the implications of our verdict for social practices, because otherwise our prejudices related to these social practices could creep in and compromise our metaphysics. And here's a closely related ethics first case for metaphysics first social metaphysics. The idea is that when we consider the implications of our metaphysical verdict for the social practices again, this would interfere with ethical progress because our metaphysics then would just reproduce our prejudices instead of guiding social reforms. For example, maybe our practice of blaming groups is mistaken and should be eliminated because groups aren't really agents in their own right. In order to allow for that possibility, we should again push out the thoughts about the implications of our metaphysical verdict when we are doing metaphysics, do the metaphysics first, and then just let our social practices follow it wherever it leads. Okay, so these were the cases for metaphysics first social metaphysics. And let's now also look at the different sorts of cases for ethics first social metaphysics, beginning with the metaphysics first cases. Hilary Putnam, in the paper that I already cited, seems to be making a sort of metaphysics first case for ethics first social metaphysics. The idea seems to be that there's just no other way to resolve the metaphysical question if we don't resort to the ethics first approach. So in that paper, he concludes that he has reviewed a succession of failures, basically failures to resolve the metaphysical issue in the metaphysics first way. And as a last resort, he must conclude that the question calls for a decision. So we must approach it in the ethics first way. And Thomason similarly seems to be making a sort of metaphysics first case for ethics first social metaphysics. In her case, it's about avoiding the methodological mysteries in metaphysics. She says that by approaching the work of metaphysics in this way, which I would call an ethics first way, we can demystify the methods of metaphysics and avoid the problem of rivalry with science also. The hope is that metaphysics can be both relevant and non-mysterious. Now, in contrast, I want to make an ethics first case for ethics first social metaphysics. My claim is that social metaphysicians, the philosophers who address these metaphysical questions with social significance, they find themselves in a situation similar to philosopher Smith here, who's one of those rare philosophers who actually works on the meaning of life. And he has this psychologically fragile, potentially suicidal friend who asks him whether life has a meaning. It would be irresponsible for Smith to say that no, actually, life doesn't have a meaning, as I've argued in my Smith 2019 paper. This response is problematic because Smith doesn't take into account the conditional that the fragile friend probably endorses. If life doesn't have a meaning, then there's no point living any further, or something along these lines. But it's irresponsible not to take this into account, because philosophers should consider how people embed their philosophical verdicts in such conditionals. Now, returning to the issue of social metaphysics, there are many widely accepted conditionals that connect metaphysical verdicts to implications for social practices. For example, if a person A is not identical to B, then A should not be held responsible for B's deaths. If a certain kind of robot is conscious, then we should treat it similarly to humans. If women are adult human females, then trans women should not be allowed in women-only spaces. And finally, if groups can be agents in their own right, then we can praise and blame such groups. And I claim that it would be irresponsible not to bear in mind that such conditionals are widely accepted when philosophers interpret and address the metaphysical issues in the antecedents of these conditionals. This is because these metaphysical antecedents are open to interpretation in a way that renders them irrelevant for the conditional. What does this mean? Let's look at the example of group agency. And the conditional, if groups can be agents in their own right, then we can praise and blame such groups. Here's a potential argument for the antecedent. Attending to the group level attitudes facilitates explanation and prediction. This is because the group level attitudes are often related to the individual attitudes in really complex and unsystematic ways. So it's cognitively much easier to keep track of the group level. So this in some sense vindicates the idea that we should recognize group agents, that group agents can be agents in their own right. But it's very unclear whether this metaphysical verdict is vindicated in a sense that is actually relevant for this conditional. And maybe the gender example is even more striking. So here's the conditional. If women are adult human females, then trans women should not be allowed in women-only spaces. And here's a potential argument for the metaphysical claim in the antecedent. There's linguistic evidence that the term woman means adult human female in English. For example, there's usage in media and dictionary definitions and speaker intuitions. So by this quotation, women are adult human females. Now, this argument makes some sense, but it's very unclear whether it vindicates the metaphysical verdict in the sense that is actually relevant for this widely accepted conditional. It seems that maybe this metaphysical conclusion is just established in some sense that is not practically relevant here, or at least not relevant for this conclusion. This leads us to the dangers of metaphysics-first social metaphysics, the sort of social metaphysics that doesn't take into account that these metaphysical verdicts are embedded in these widely accepted conditionals. Such social metaphysics could turn out to be irrelevant for social practices. So that's one threat. But even more importantly, the social metaphysics could nevertheless appear relevant, and it could mistakenly inform social practices. For example, this argument from the meaning of the term woman could be used to exclude trans women from women's spaces. Now, since these are worries about the ethical responsibilities of philosophers and not metaphysics-related reasons, this is a kind of ethics-first case for ethics-first social metaphysics. In conclusion, I have identified an issue in the methodology of social metaphysics, namely the choice between the metaphysics-first and ethics-first approaches. I also distinguished between second-order ethics-first and metaphysics-first approaches to defending either of the first-order approaches. And finally, I sketched an ethical case for ethics-first social metaphysics. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.